But what I really want to talk about actually is a concept of quality in content. In many of the markets where we operate today, particularly in North America and Europe, where you have lots of competition with interactive whiteboards, it is sometimes a kind of horse race determined over quantity of content. And so what people want to know is, how many lessons do you bundle together with your whiteboard? Or how many lessons are available on your web community portal, which most of the major interactive whiteboard companies provide. And we are committed, particularly with the introduction of our new suite of interactive classroom products, which you can see the prototypes here at eINDIA. We're committed to making the process and act of using technology in the classroom a lot simpler for teachers. And in fact, our theme is simply teaching. But in doing that, we also have to pay attention to still delivering the quality. Sorry, I'm just looking for my controls here. And effectiveness in that content. So what I'm going to try and do here in a very few minutes is condense about an hour-long workshop that was produced by our Director of Content Strategy, Dr. Karen Mahan, where we talk about how do you define quality in interactive content, particularly lesson content. And again, I'll apologize if this has a little more of or too much of a Western or North American, European orientation, but I hope it will be relevant also here in India. First of all, there are standards. Standards provided by federal government, but very often by state governments, particularly in the United States. And content aspires to align to those standards, but sometimes those standards are not very well articulated. Another feature of interactive or digital content is that kids and teachers like it. It's pretty, it's colorful, it's dynamic, it's visually appealing. And the very popular term that tends to be used when you talk about interactive whiteboards is engaged. Students are more engaged if you have interactive technology. But is that really enough? Being engaged doesn't necessarily mean that you are learning. So we believe that interactive classroom technology providers like Mimeo and others can do better. And in doing better, we can allow technology to be more effective and more powerful in the classroom. So what we call the three secrets are what I'd like to very rapidly describe to you. First of all, content should embed learning objectives, and those objectives should focus on observable and measurable student behavior. The reason it's interactive is that it enables students to act and to both demonstrate and reinforce learning. So those objectives should provide a measure of achievement of learning. They should communicate expectations to the student very clearly, and they should provide the student with an opportunity to select or for the teachers to select and create and deliver appropriate learning experiences. So, for example, in a lesson like this, the objective involves the student taking an action of identifying a certain function of adaptation, in this case, how they use a mouth, and so the student can select terms and match them to the images. And I won't go through the whole thing, but pause for my computer. There we go. Here's an example of a not atypical student should interact with the material. So I mentioned before that objectives are sometimes not clearly articulated. If you go through the state standards of many states of the United States, you will find standards that are stated like this: the student will learn about classroom technology. Well, is that observable? Is it measurable? No, it certainly is not. On the other hand, the student will draw an equilateral triangle. Well, that is something that a student can come to the board and draw. It is observable, it is measurable, and it is accessible. So if we look at Bloom's taxonomy of learning, you obviously go from knowledge up to evaluation. Knowledge is pretty simple and straightforward, but can we develop measurable or observable learning objectives for the higher order learning? And the answer to that is actually yes, and I could go into some detail, but time is not going to permit that. But at the knowledge level, of course, here's an example. The student must list at least 5 of the 6 local community organizations for health maintenance covered in a course. Well, that's knowledge, and yes, we clearly can create exercises whereby the student can demonstrate measurable behavior. On the other hand, you might have something like indicate how a particular home remedy folklore would affect the health of a given community and why. Well, that's a much more complicated learning, and that's actually at the evaluation level, and yet it is something that you can structure a lesson and you can have student activities that demonstrate an understanding of that objective, an achievement of that objective. So the answer, can we cover the full spectrum of Bloom's taxonomy with observable and measurable lesson activity? The answer is absolutely yes, we can. So the second secret of quality content is that the assessment of that content has to be appropriate to the learning objective. So it has to involve, for example, things like the student can dissect a frog, not that the student understands the anatomy of a frog. The student can spell words on the spelling list, identify mammals versus reptiles, can find a given city or location on a map. It is also important, and this is where technology, like interactive technology, whether it's whiteboards or other interactive systems, needs to be overt. And for example, if your learning objective is the student will understand Spanish vocabulary, well, that's not very overt, is it? You can't see or measure understanding. You need to structure lessons that involve something that's more overt. Now, there can be some ambiguity. If you have a learning objective to read the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, that may or may not be overt, depending on whether you read it out loud or you read it silently. Okay, in a lot of interactive technology-based lessons, the assessments can be selected response or constructed response. And you can use interactive technology both ways. Obviously, selected response is well understood, whether it's this kind of thing where you select a particular item, but it can also be an activity where a student comes to the board and uses a pen tool and actually will list something. This is a little hard to do with the trackpad, so I'm not going to do it very well, but you understand what I'm talking about. Okay, I'm going to go faster and faster here. Secret number 3, you must provide the student with as many opportunities as possible to practice those skills. If you're going to want to discriminate or identify their understanding of reptiles, amphibians, and mollusks, you need to give them more than 3 choices. However, it's not uncommon to find interactive lessons that are structured like this. But they're not very rigorous, and they don't really reinforce or provide the teacher with adequate assessment opportunities for student understanding. So the responses, by the way, should not only be accurate, but they should be fast. Therefore, you can use the technology to embed timers, and you can structure the lesson so that it has a time component, a competitive component, all of which helps to further engage students. You can also build the difficulty level of the lesson over time, and so you can go from a few choices to more choices to many choices, and then you can add the time factor. So you can evolve the assessment and the difficulty and quality of the lessons. You want to avoid embedding any gratuitous giveaways in the lesson. This is not going to be very relevant for India since you don't celebrate Thanksgiving here, but this exercise, for example, could be compromised just by adding something like a reference to Thanksgiving, which would tell all the students that, oh yes, well, we know where the pumpkins came from. It came from the Indians. Okay, and you also, in the course of building interactive content, you want to embed wrong answers as options, again, to ensure that the understanding is thorough, and finally, that there should be feedback. And again, interactive technology or technology in general allows opportunity to distinguish between correct answers and wrong answers in the course of interacting with the content. Okay, and I'm going to wrap up with that. I'm sorry this is very rushed, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, and thank you for your attention.